the padding stitch is basically a series of horizontal bites on a series of vertical rows. Now, the purpose of the padding stitch is to hold multiple layers down. There is a misconception that the padding stitch creates shape, which is total nonsense. Shape is created when there is a difference in length between the two layers that are sewn together by any stitch. Having said that, let's look at how the stitch is done. The general rule is that if you're right-handed, you sew from right to left, and if you're left-handed, from left to right. So as I'm right-handed, I'm starting from the top. I could also start from the bottom, doesn't really matter. I'll start from the top, and in this case, from the center, and work my way from the right to the left. So we take a bite of about 1/8. Why 1/8? Because the padding stitch is usually used to join the layers of the canvas. And one side of that canvas is going to be covered with fabric. And that's the side where the bites are visible, not the actual stitch. If there is too much thread showing on the side of the bites, what you'll get if you press, with a too heavy iron or too hot iron, you see the indentations of the threads on the fabric, especially if it's a lightweight fabric. But we want to prevent that, so it's good to create a habit of taking smaller bites, like 1/8 or 3 millimeters, every time we're doing a padding stitch. Unless you have full control over what you're doing, then take whatever bite you want. So we take a bite, and then underneath it we put the next bite. The distance between these bites, on average, can vary. It could be 3/8, it could be 1 inch, it could be 2 inches. It really depends on what you're trying to achieve. For now, I'm doing a distance of, let's say, about 1/2 inch. So then we put the next bite, and the next bite, and the next bite. You can do the padding stitch flat on your board, or you could also hold it in your hands. To make the demonstration easier, I'm doing it flat, but if I'm padding a pair of canvases, then I'm holding the canvases in my hand, because it allows me to sew a lot quicker, and it's a bit more comfortable. I can stand the way I want to stand, and feel the stitch a bit more as I'm going through the canvas. So we've done the stitches now. We want to go up, because what we have to do is go from upwards, downwards, and then upwards again, downwards, and vice versa. Where do we place our next stitch? The next stitch is always going to be in front and in the middle of the two previous bites. Okay, so this is one bite, this is one bite, this is one bite, this is one bite, and 2 bites make 1 stitch. So when I move upwards, I have to make sure that the needle is in front and between the 2 previous bites. So this gives me this location, like this. If I move up again, it's going to be up in the front and between the 2 previous bites, like so. If I would only go in between the 2 previous bites, that would be here. So this is one bite, this is one bite, in between would be like that. But I have to go in front and in between. So like that. Now, you might recognize this famous pattern of the padding stitch, which is on all tailoring books, magazines, and photos, which is the staggered effect. And it's actually a nice stitch to do if you want to increase the speed of your needle and thimble technique, and get a bit more consistency in the mechanics of your hand. Now, you may have a question, and that question is going to probably sound something like, well, how do I know what the distance should be between each row? And how can I get good consistency and good coverage with my stitches? Well, that's fairly simple. What you have to do is every time you go in between and in front of the 2 previous bites. You have to make sure that the distance between the needle and the previous stitch, which is this thread, I call that one stitch, which it consists out of 2 bites. You have to make sure that the point where the needle goes in is the same distance as your bite. So my bite is 1/8. If I want to go in front and in between the 2 previous bites, I have to make sure that the tip of my needle is 1/8 away from this thread, which gives me this point. Again, if I go down to put my needle in front and between the 2 previous bites, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this thread and make sure that my needle starts and goes in the fabric 1/8 away from that thread, basically my bite size, like that. And again, if I go down and I want to go in between and in front of the 2 previous bites, I'm going to make sure that where the needle goes in is 1/8 away of this thread that I'm putting it in front of, like so. And again, I go down. You could also follow the angle of this line that you have above the point where you're going to put your needle. In front and between the 2 previous bites, 1/8 away, or your bite size away from the thread where the needle is going to be in front of, like so. And that's how you do a basic padding stitch. Now, what you have to keep in mind is how not to do a padding stitch. How you shouldn't do a padding stitch is like the following. And this is only a padding stitch on a canvas. I mean, you can still do this stitch if you know why you're doing it and you know what the stitch does, but never do something by accident without analyzing it. So even if you do something by accident, it may be actually really good and have a lot of value, but if you don't analyze it, then you don't know whether it's good or bad. So suppose you do your first row, like that. And then when you want to move up, instead of going in front and in between the 2 previous bites, you only go in front of the previous bite. So this is the previous bite, I now go in front of the previous bite. This is the previous bite, I now go in front of the previous bite. This is the previous bite, I now go in front of the previous bite. And you do that, and at some point you get this pattern and you're like, man, this really looks nice, you know, why am I not doing it like that? You know, this is how I'm going to, this is my style. This is how I'm going to do this padding stitch. Well, there's a problem with this stitch if you are using this to pad your canvases. What's wrong? Well, this is wrong. If I would, let me just snip this. If I would flip this over, when you look at this padding that is wrong, you see a series of stitches with a big distance in between them, horizontal stitches with a big gap in between them. You also notice that every stitch is in line vertically with the other, more or less. However, with the one that is done the correct way, you see that every line is displaced. So whereas here we have a series of stitches, the next one is in the middle of the 2 bites in the previous row. And then the next one is again in the middle of the 2 previous bites in the previous row. What that does is it breaks the pattern of this channel effect. If you would cover this entire thing with the type of stitching that I said you shouldn't do, you just get long channels. And when you get long channels and you have multiple layers sewn together, what's going to happen is if you bend the canvas downwards, you're very likely to get bubbles trapped in between the 2 rows. Especially if you're not used to handling the canvas and the technique and all of that. Whereas with this one, every channel has another channel in between it. So the distance between the channels is a lot smaller. This breaks that channel pattern and prevents any bubbles from forming in the horizontal and the vertical direction. Your body is obviously more likely to bend forwards and backwards in the vertical direction. So you don't really need to worry about the horizontal direction, but it's mainly the vertical direction that we are talking about. However, you can perfectly use this stitching for any reason that you have if you do want to create channels and you do want to create that effect. So be aware of that. Now, the other thing that I want you to be conscious of is what the tension of the padding stitch should be. So if we would, let's say, make a stitch and we want to do the next stitch, make sure that when you pull your thread, as I explained, you're regulating the tension with your pink finger. Now, when you pull, don't pull, let me do one more, don't pull so much that you get this tension on the fabric, this drawn together, this gathering, because that's going to create problems for your canvas. Your canvas should be smooth. Also, don't do it so loose that your thread is just like this, floating on top, like, you know, worms. Every time you pull the stitch with your pink finger, suppose you're holding the fabric down, when the thread is at the optimum tension, as you're pulling it up, any more than that is going to lift the fabric. And it's going to, you can feel that beyond that point, you're going to have to really pull to, you know, create this tension. It's going to, you know, if you pull any more than that, it's going to create tension. So keep that in mind. You want your padding stitches to be so that every time you run your fingers over them, you can feel that there is movement in them, but they're not loose. And, you know, also don't come up with terms like, oh, otherwise it doesn't breathe, or it, you know, it's not, you know, it doesn't have a heart pumping through it. So it's going to be a misleading term. So keep that in mind. Also, another thing you shouldn't do is that when you're doing a padding, like, you know, when we do a running stitch and we sometimes do 1, 2, 3, and then we pull the thread. Don't do this with a padding stitch. So don't do 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4, whatever, and then pull. Because what's going to happen is, look, you're going to put so much more tension on the last stitch just to get the tension of the first stitch correct. You see? So if you look from up close, you can see that there is more tension in the last stitch than the first one. And if I would continue that again, so 1, 2, 3, and I would pull again, you can see just by getting the first stitch sit on correctly, I would have to pull a lot of tension on the last stitch. And then you get dodgy stitching. So just do them one by one and make sure that the tension is correct. So having said that, I think it's safe to say that now you know how to do a padding stitch.